The range was busy that Saturday morning, the metallic crack of rifles echoing against the worn concrete walls and the acrid tang of spent gunpowder hanging heavy in the air. A cluster of regulars had gathered near the far end, where they always staked their claim, loud with bravado and inside jokes that excluded anyone not in their circle. They were the type who came less to practice and more to perform, to show off gear and argue about calibers as if each one of them were an authority on weapons. When the woman walked in, slight of frame, a worn ball cap pulled low over her brow, and a duffel slung casually over her shoulder, their laughter rose a little louder as though to announce they had already judged her. To them, she was another weekend amateur, maybe someone's girlfriend tagging along, a distraction in a place they considered their own. She didn't acknowledge the group or their sideways glances. She simply signed the clipboard, paid her lane fee and set her duffel down at stall 12. The man behind the counter, new to the job, tried to make polite conversation, but she brushed it off with a tight smile, her single visible eye glinting beneath the cap. The other eye, hidden behind a matte black patch, gave her face an air of severity, though most people never stared long enough to find the story behind it. She moved with quiet efficiency, laying out her rifle, checking her sidearm, loading her magazines with practiced motions that made the counter clerk pause. He wasn't the only one watching. The group down at the far lanes had taken notice, and one of them, stocky, with a shaved head and a voice that carried, snickered loud enough for everyone to hear. "Bet she couldn't hit the broad side of a barn," he said, smirking at his friends. They chuckled in unison, the kind of laughter meant to sting, meant to remind the outsider she wasn't welcome. Another chimed in, mimicking a falsetto voice, "Oh look, she's got a patch. Maybe she lost her eye trying to load the gun backward." That earned them a roar of laughter, echoing across the range. A few patrons frowned, but no one intervened. This was how it usually went with that crew: swagger, mockery, and a need to prove they were the loudest in the room. The woman said nothing. She fitted her ear protection, adjusted the sling of her rifle, and took a long, steadying breath. The lane beside hers was occupied by a young man barely old enough to rent a rifle. He shifted uncomfortably at the laughter, glancing at her, then at the group, unsure of whether to speak. She caught his look, gave a small shake of her head and stepped into her lane. With the ease of muscle memory, she shouldered the rifle and sighted downrange. Her posture was flawless, her breathing calm and her trigger discipline immaculate. The mocking voices carried on, trying to pierce the bubble of her focus. Her first shot rang out, sharp and decisive. The bullet tore through the paper target at 100 yards with surgical precision, dead center. A second shot followed, and a third, each one drilling the same hole, the grouping so tight it looked as though only one round had struck. The boy beside her gaped, his own half-decent grouping suddenly looking like scattershot. The laughter at the far end faltered, just slightly, but one of them covered the lapse with another jeer. "Lucky shots. Anyone can get 3 right if they've practiced with training wheels." Their words were weaker now, though forced. She ignored them still, feeding another magazine and shifting to her sidearm. At 20 yards, she drew and fired in rapid succession. 10 rounds, 10 perfect center mass hits. The smell of cordite grew thicker, the rhythm of her shooting steady, almost hypnotic. Patrons further down began to take notice, leaning slightly to watch. The clerk at the counter stopped pretending to rearrange the rental forms and simply stared. There was a precision to her movements, an aura that spoke not of hobby but of discipline, the kind forged only in places where mistakes cost lives. The group at the far lanes grew quieter as she continued. They still muttered, but their words carried less conviction now, drowned by the relentless accuracy unfolding before them. The young man beside her finally couldn't resist. He tugged his earmuffs down and asked, "Ma'am, how long have you been shooting?" She lowered her weapon, flicked the safety, and regarded him for a moment. Her expression softened just a fraction. "Long enough," she said simply, her voice low, gravelly, touched by something that hinted at weariness. It wasn't an answer meant to invite further questions, but it was enough to plant a seed of curiosity. Her duffel still had more to offer. She set aside the rifle, drew out another firearm, an older model pistol, clearly worn by years of use. She ran her thumb over the grip, almost reverently, then loaded it with a smoothness that betrayed 1,000 repetitions. The first shot cracked the air, and the target quivered as another perfect hole appeared at center. The regulars at the far end had gone silent now, watching under the guise of loading magazines or checking their sights. The stocky one who'd laughed first tried to save face with a muttered, "All right, not bad," but even his tone lacked conviction. What they didn't know, what none of them could know from looking, was that she had done this before in places far removed from the comfort of a public range. She had steadied her breath in the dust of foreign deserts, her sight fixed on shapes that moved under a burning sun. She had counted rounds not in magazines but in the moments she prayed would be enough to see her squad home. She had bled into the soil of lands most of these men couldn't point to on a map, and she had lost an eye in the kind of nightmarish firestorm that no civilian range could ever mimic. To her this was not performance. It was survival made muscle memory. By the time she set down her weapons and peeled back her ear protection, the range had shifted. Conversations were hushed, and the same men who had mocked her earlier avoided her gaze. She didn't gloat, didn't even look their way. She simply gathered her things with the same quiet efficiency she had unpacked them, leaving behind a target sheet so clean it looked like something from a training manual. The boy beside her whispered, "That was amazing." She gave him a small nod, then turned and walked toward the exit, her boots echoing softly on the concrete. Only when the door swung shut behind her did the murmurs begin, the realization sinking in among those who had watched. She hadn't come to impress them. She hadn't come to prove anything. But without a word, she had reminded them that not all battles were fought for sport, and not every scar was visible. For the men who had mocked her, it was a quiet lesson, delivered not with anger but with a steadiness they could never match. And though they didn't yet know the full truth, whispers would spread soon enough, about the woman with one eye, the soldier who had served 3 tours, and the shooter who never missed. The ride home was quiet, the hum of her old truck filling the space where music might have been. She didn't much care for radios anymore. Too often the wrong song came on, one that yanked her backward into memories she'd rather not relive. The road stretched long and empty, broken only by the faded outlines of fields and telephone poles ticking by like metronomes. Her hands gripped the steering wheel loosely, knuckles pale but steady, while her patched eye throbbed faintly with the kind of dull ache that never fully left. She could still hear their laughter echoing inside her skull, not because it hurt her pride but because it was familiar. It wasn't the first time she'd been underestimated. It wasn't the first time people had looked at her and seen something fragile, broken, unworthy of their respect. And yet every time she proved them wrong without needing to lift her voice. Action spoke louder. Bullets spoke clearest of all. Her house sat at the edge of town, modest and worn, the kind of place most people passed without remembering. The porch sagged in one corner and the paint peeled in strips from the siding, but it was hers. She parked the truck in the gravel driveway and killed the engine. For a moment she sat there in the stillness, staring at the crooked mailbox leaning like an old soldier by the road. Her chest rose and fell in slow, deliberate breaths, each one carrying the weight of the day. Only after several minutes did she gather her gear and step out, boots crunching against gravel. Inside the house was neat but sparse. Pictures lined the mantel, faded photographs of people who were no longer here. Squad members, smiling faces frozen in time, names that still whispered in her mind late at night. She touched one frame lightly with her fingertips before setting her duffel down. In the kitchen she brewed coffee strong enough to strip paint the way she liked it. She sat at the worn oak table, staring at the rising steam, letting the bitter aroma ground her. It was strange how the range always pulled her into a storm of emotions. She didn't shoot to impress, not anymore. Once maybe. Back before the tours, back before the loss. Now it was routine, a discipline that tethered her to sanity. Without it, the ghosts came closer, whispering too loudly to ignore. She sipped the coffee, grimacing at the heat, and closed her eye, letting the bitterness wash through her chest like armor. Her phone buzzed on the counter, shattering the stillness. She glanced at the screen, the name lighting up sending a ripple of something complicated through her. It was Daniel, Sergeant Daniel Reyes, once her closest comrade, now one of the few who still called to check in. She debated letting it ring out, but in the end she answered. "You alive?" His voice crackled, rough as gravel, the way it had always been. She huffed a short laugh. "Barely," she said. There was silence, then his low chuckle. "Heard you made some noise at the range again. Word travels fast." She frowned. "Already?" He didn't need to explain. In small towns, stories spread quicker than bullets. Someone had seen, someone had talked, and now the tale was already winding through the grapevine. "They said you embarrassed those boys pretty bad," Reyes said. "About time somebody did." She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temple. "It wasn't about embarrassing anyone. I was just keeping sharp." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't the whole truth. There was something satisfying about watching arrogance deflate, about seeing mockery silenced by skill. Reyes must have heard it in her tone because he laughed again, softer this time. "You've always been like that. Quiet storm. Don't need to talk, just act. Scares the hell out of people." She didn't respond. Instead, she took another sip of coffee, letting the heat scald her throat. Reyes shifted the subject, as he always did when the silence stretched too long. "Got an invite for you," he said. "Veterans gathering next weekend. Barbecue, music, the whole bit. Some of the old crew will be there. Thought maybe you'd want to come." She froze, the idea landing like a stone in her gut. Gatherings meant stories. Gatherings meant faces she hadn't seen in years, faces she associated with things best left buried. And yet a part of her, the part that still craved connection, stirred faintly. She hesitated. "I'll think about it." It was the safest answer, the one she always gave. Reyes didn't push. "All right. Just, don't hide forever, all right?" His voice softened. "You've earned the right to be seen." She hung up soon after, setting the phone face down on the counter as though to silence it. That night the dreams came again. They always did when the range dredged up the memories. Sand, heat, the smell of iron in the air. Shouts in the distance, radio static hissing like snakes. She saw her squad moving through narrow alleys, her rifle steady, her voice calm as she called positions. Then the explosion, blinding, searing pain, the world reduced to chaos. She woke gasping, clutching at the patch over her ruined eye, sweat slicking her skin. The house was silent, but inside her head, the noise hadn't stopped. She sat on the edge of the bed, trembling, until the adrenaline subsided. Then, as always, she got up, made more coffee, and prepared for another day. The next morning, the consequences of the range encounter arrived sooner than expected. At the diner where she sometimes ate breakfast, heads turned as she walked in. Conversations dipped, rose again with curious undertones. She ignored them, ordered her usual, and sat in the corner booth. It wasn't long before a man approached, mid-30s, hair cropped short, wearing a faded Marine's cap. He stopped at her table, shifting awkwardly. "Ma'am," he said, "I just wanted to say, I heard what happened yesterday. At the range. Those guys had it coming. Folks around here don't always understand, but some of us do. Respect." He gave a short nod, then left before she could reply. She stared after him, her appetite evaporating. Respect. The word felt heavy, almost undeserved. She finished her meal quickly, left cash on the table, and walked out under the weight of too many eyes. She'd never sought attention, but now it clung to her whether she wanted it or not. On the sidewalk, she paused, the morning sun glaring off car hoods, and thought of Rhea's invitation. Maybe he was right. Maybe hiding wasn't working anymore. Maybe proving herself at the range had stirred something she couldn't ignore. But stepping back into that world meant opening old wounds, and she wasn't sure how many more scars she could carry. For now, she walked on, the decision postponed, the future uncertain, but the past still heavy on her shoulders. The days slipped by in their usual rhythm, but something in the air felt different now, as if the silence she had cultivated so carefully was beginning to crack. The incident at the range had stirred curiosity in the town, and though most people were too polite, or too intimidated, to approach her directly, she could feel their stares more often, hear the half-whispered conversations that tapered off when she entered a room. For years, she had been the ghost at the edge of their community, the woman with the eye patch and the distant gaze, a veteran who had returned but never really come home. Now, suddenly, she was the subject of their stories, not for her scars or her silence, but for her skill. It unsettled her more than the mockery had. She had made peace with being dismissed. Being noticed was something else entirely. She tried to maintain her routines. Mornings at the diner, afternoons working odd repair jobs around her property, evenings running through dry fire drills in the solitude of her living room. But the weight of expectation seemed to press on her with every passing day. At the hardware store, an older man nodded in her direction and murmured something about bravery. At the gas station, a teenager asked if she could teach him to shoot. Even the clerk at the range, the one who had watched her that Saturday, smiled differently now, a mixture of awe and awkwardness. It wasn't hostility, but it wasn't comfort either. Respect, she thought again, that heavy word. It had a way of building walls just as high as ridicule. Late one evening, as she sat on the porch with her second mug of coffee, she thought of Reyes. His voice replayed in her mind, "You've earned the right to be seen." She stared out at the darkening fields, the fireflies blinking like sparks in the distance, and wondered if he was right. She had spent years shrinking into herself, hiding her pain and her memories because she believed the world had no place for them. But perhaps it wasn't just about her anymore. Perhaps the stories mattered not for her sake but for the younger ones, the boy at the range, the teenager at the gas station, who needed to see that strength didn't always look like the loudest man in the room. When Reyes called again midweek, she didn't let it go to voicemail. "You coming?" he asked, his tone lighter this time as though he already suspected her answer. She hesitated only a moment before saying, "Yeah, I'll come." The silence on the other end stretched into a smile she could almost hear. "Good. You won't regret it." She wasn't so sure about that, but she marked the date anyway. The idea of stepping into a gathering of veterans, of faces who might remember her not just as she was but as she had been, sent a flutter of unease through her chest. But the decision was made, and in some strange way that gave her relief. The day of the gathering arrived warm and bright, the kind of summer day that might have been beautiful had she not felt the weight of it pressing down on her. She drove the truck along back roads, the windows down, the smell of cut grass drifting through. The address Reyes had given led to a wide open field outside of town, where folding tables had been set up under canvas tents and smoke from a barbecue pit curled lazily into the sky. Country music spilled from portable speakers, laughter rang out in bursts, and people in faded uniforms and ball caps moved easily among one another. She parked at the edge, sat for a long moment gripping the steering wheel, then finally forced herself to step out. Reyes spotted her before she had taken 10 steps. He looked older, heavier in the shoulders, but the grin on his face was the same. "There she is," he said, striding over to pull her into a rough hug. She stiffened for a second before allowing it, the familiarity stirring something she hadn't felt in years. "Wasn't sure you'd come." "Neither was I," she admitted, her voice low. He laughed, clapping her on the back. "Come on. Let me introduce you around." The introductions were awkward at first. Men and women she vaguely remembered from other units, other tours, faces she had seen through the haze of adrenaline and smoke. Some recognized her immediately, calling her by the nickname she hadn't heard in nearly a decade, Hawk, a nod to the eye she'd lost and the sharper one she still had. She flinched at the sound of it, but forced herself to smile, nodding at their jokes and their memories. With each handshake, each clap on the shoulder, the wall she'd built around herself thinned just a little. They didn't look at her with pity. They looked at her like one of their own, someone who had been there, who still belonged. As the evening stretched on, she found herself sitting at one of the long tables, a plate of barbecue in front of her and Reyes beside her. The conversation flowed easily, stories tumbling out of the group with the same rhythm they always had. There were jokes about botched supply runs, arguments about who had been the worst driver in the convoy, laughter that rolled like thunder. And then, inevitably, the stories turned darker, memories of nights under fire, of names that weren't here to laugh with them anymore. The air grew heavy, but it was not suffocating. It was shared. For the first time in years, she felt the knot in her chest loosen just slightly. One man across the table leaned forward, his expression serious. "Heard you put on a show at the range last week," he said. The table quieted, eyes turning toward her. She shifted uncomfortably, pushing food around her plate. "It wasn't a show," she muttered. "Just practice." But Reyes chuckled. "Practice or not, you shut a few mouths. Word is spreading." She frowned, but another voice chimed in, softer. "Good. People need to remember what it looks like. Real skill. Real service." She looked around at them then, saw the nods of agreement, and something inside her softened. Maybe it wasn't about pride. Maybe it was about reminding the world that sacrifice left behind more than scars. It left behind strength too. As night fell and lanterns were lit, she sat back, listening to the chorus of voices rise around her. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like an outsider. She felt like a soldier again, not because of the stories, not because of the laughter, but because of the unspoken bond that had always tied them together. The bond of those who had been mocked, underestimated, broken, and yet had endured. And though she still carried the ache of loss, the throb behind her ruined eye, the restless memories that woke her at night, she felt something else too, a flicker of belonging, fragile but real. The following week returned her to quiet routines, but the gathering had left a mark. It wasn't something she could put into words, not even to herself, but it lingered like the warmth of a fire long after the flames had gone out. For years she had convinced herself that solitude was her only refuge, that walls and silence were her armor. Yet sitting at that table, hearing her name, Hawk, spoken not with pity but with camaraderie, had reminded her of something she had buried. She was not only the sum of her scars. She was part of something larger, a story written in sweat, blood, and unbreakable bonds. That knowledge gnawed at her as she moved through her days, pulling at threads she had thought were long stitched closed. It wasn't long before the town pulled her further into the spotlight she hadn't sought. At the range, people she had never spoken to before nodded in greeting or struck up conversations about rifles and calibers. A high school coach approached her one afternoon, asking if she'd consider speaking to the school's junior ROTC program. She declined politely, but the request stayed with her, echoing in the back of her mind. The boy from the neighboring lane had shown up again, nervously asking if she'd give him pointers. She tried to brush him off, but his earnestness wore her down. Within minutes she was guiding his stance, adjusting his grip, showing him how to control his breathing. When his shot landed squarely on target, his grin was wide enough to slice through the shadows clinging to her chest. Against her better judgment, she found herself smiling too. But not everyone was content to let her reputation settle quietly. The same men who had mocked her that first Saturday still showed up at the range, though their laughter had dulled to nervous chuckles. Their pride, however, had not vanished. One evening as she was packing up, the stocky one with the shaved head approached. His smirk was tighter now, forced. "Not bad," he said, leaning against the partition. "But anybody can get lucky a few times. Doesn't mean you're some kind of legend." She met his eyes without flinching. "It's not luck," she said evenly. "It's discipline." He scoffed, but there was no laughter behind it. "Discipline or not, I don't buy it. Bet if we went head-to-head I'd come out on top." His friends muttered agreement, their bravado thin but stubborn. She didn't rise to the bait. She had nothing to prove to them. But something inside her stirred, not pride, but the knowledge that arrogance unchecked could spread like a disease. She leaned closer, her voice calm, almost cold. "You don't want that." For the first time, uncertainty flickered in his expression. He opened his mouth to retort, then thought better of it, backing away with a muttered curse. She let him go, but the exchange left her restless. It wasn't about beating them, it was about what they represented. The casual disrespect for what they didn't understand, the mockery of scars they had never earned. She had endured worse than their words, but part of her burned at the thought of letting them walk away unchallenged. That night, sleep didn't come easy. She tossed under the weight of half-formed dreams, the laughter of boys at the range twisting into echoes of younger soldiers under her command, cocky and untested, their bravado brittle in the face of real fire. She remembered the ones who hadn't made it, the way arrogance had sometimes cost lives. By dawn, she sat at her kitchen table with coffee cooling in her hands, staring at the empty space across from her. Maybe Reyes was right again. Maybe there was more she could be doing than just surviving quietly on the margins. Maybe silence wasn't strength anymore, it was surrender. 2 days later, the opportunity presented itself in an unexpected way. The local sheriff's department hosted a charity shooting competition, a fundraiser that drew law enforcement, veterans, and civilians alike. Flyers were pinned around town, boasting prizes and bragging rights. Reyes called to ask if she'd go. She was ready to decline, but the thought of those men at the range, their sneers, their doubt, gnawed at her resolve. Maybe this wasn't about them at all. Maybe it was about showing the wider world what discipline, what sacrifice, what survival looked like when translated through steel and powder. She told Reyes yes. His chuckle of approval carried through the line. The day of the competition dawned bright and sharp, the air humming with anticipation. Dozens gathered at the outdoor range, booths set up with food, tents shading families, music drifting from portable speakers. She arrived quietly, duffel slung over her shoulder, her presence drawing curious stares almost immediately. Reyes waved her over, grinning like a proud brother. "Glad you made it," he said, handing her a number tag. "You ready?" She adjusted the strap of her rifle case, her voice steady. "Always." The events tested speed, accuracy, and endurance, with targets ranging from stationary paper to moving steel plates. She moved through each stage with the same quiet efficiency that had silenced the range before. Her shots landed with surgical precision, her reloads seamless, her movements fluid as though time itself slowed for her. The crowd began to gather, drawn by the spectacle of someone who didn't miss, who didn't falter. Children leaned on the barriers wide-eyed. Veterans in faded uniforms nodded knowingly, recognizing the posture of someone forged in fire. Even law enforcement officers, competitive by nature, watched with a respect that needed no words. The men who had mocked her were there too, their bravado faltering as they watched her carve through the stages. When it was their turn, they blustered loudly, firing with showy aggression. Their shots scattered wide, their reloads clumsy. The crowd's reaction told the story more clearly than scores ever could. What had once been their domain now belonged to someone they had dismissed. And she hadn't needed to mock them back, hadn't needed to raise her voice. She simply did what she had always done, let her actions speak. When the competition ended, her name sat at the top of every scoreboard. Applause broke out, scattered at first, then swelling into something undeniable. She stood at the edge, uncomfortable with the attention, but unable to deny the flicker of warmth it brought. Reyes clapped her on the shoulder, grinning wide. "Told you," he said. "The world needs to see it." She shook her head, but a small, reluctant smile tugged at her lips. For once she didn't feel like running from it. That evening, back home, she set her duffel down and stared at the photographs on her mantel. Her squad, her family in another life. For so long she had carried their memory in silence, afraid that speaking it aloud would shatter her. But maybe sharing it, through actions, through presence, wasn't betrayal. Maybe it was honor. She touched one of the frames gently, whispering under her breath, "Still with me." The words were soft, but in the quiet of her house they carried weight. The days after the competition felt different, though nothing in her routines had truly changed. The house was the same, the town unchanged, the chores and the coffee and the long drives into quiet fields all as they had been. Yet within her there was a shift, subtle but undeniable, as though a weight she had carried for years had lightened just enough to let her breathe deeper. For the first time in a long time, she caught herself standing straighter in public, her shoulders not curled in defense but squared with quiet assurance. The whispers in town still followed her, but they no longer pressed like suffocating fog. They had turned from curiosity into something warmer, something closer to recognition. She was no longer just the woman with the eye patch. She was the veteran, the shooter, the survivor who had nothing left to prove yet proved it anyway. Reyes called often now, his voice weaving back into the fabric of her days like it had during deployments when radios were their lifelines. He teased her about the competition, told her the sheriff himself had been impressed, and half-jokingly suggested she could put the department's deputies to shame. She laughed it off, but beneath the banter was an unspoken truth. People were beginning to look at her differently, and it was stirring questions she had avoided for too long. Could she do more than survive on the edges of her town? Could she take the fragments of herself that war had left and shape them into something that mattered again? One afternoon, while walking out of the hardware store, she was stopped by a woman in her 40s wearing a faded army t-shirt. Her eyes were kind but heavy, the way eyes get when they've seen more than they ever wanted. "You don't know me," the woman said quietly, "but my husband served in Afghanistan. He didn't come back the same. Our son wants to learn to shoot and I think it might help him, give him some of the discipline his dad used to have. Would you?" She trailed off, searching for words. "Would you consider teaching him?" For a long moment the veteran stood silent, the old instinct to retreat rising strong. But then she saw the woman's hand twisting nervously in the hem of her shirt, saw the plea not just for her son but for stability, for hope. Against the familiar resistance inside her, she nodded. "Yeah," she said softly. "I can do that." The boy came to the range the next weekend, awkward and shy but eager. She guided him carefully, her tone firm but patient, just as she had once done for new recruits who had been too green to know how to hold a rifle. She corrected his grip, steadied his breathing, taught him not to rush the trigger. His first shots were wide, his frustration sharp, but she kept him steady. "Discipline," she told him, "is about consistency, not perfection. Every shot teaches you something." By the end of the hour, his grouping had tightened, and his smile broke something open in her chest. It wasn't just about hitting targets. It was about seeing potential, about passing forward something that had kept her alive when the world burned. Word spread faster than she expected. Within a month, more teenagers showed up, some with parents, some without, asking if she'd show them what she knew. At first she resisted, taking on only one or two. But soon it became routine. Saturday mornings at the range, a line of kids eager to learn. She kept it structured, strict, no bravado, no nonsense. She drilled them on safety, on discipline, on respect for the weapon and the responsibility it carried. And to her surprise, she found herself looking forward to it. The weight of her past didn't vanish, but sharing her skill, seeing it take root in others, gave her days a purpose she hadn't felt since she left the service. Not everyone approved. The same men who had mocked her watched with scowls as her circle of students grew. Their pride had taken too many blows, and bitterness festered where respect should have been. One evening, as she loaded gear into her truck, the stocky one stepped forward again, his jaw tight. "What's your game?" he demanded. She looked at him calmly. "There's no game. You trying to make us look bad? Trying to turn this place into your little school?" She met his glare without blinking. "I'm teaching them what you never learned, discipline." His fists clenched, but he said nothing more, retreating with anger sparking in his eyes. She knew it wasn't over. That night Reyes called again. When she told him about the confrontation, his chuckle was grim. "Some men can't handle seeing strength where they don't expect it. You're threatening their pride, and pride is a fragile thing." She sighed. "I'm not trying to threaten anyone. I just don't want these kids to think arrogance is the same thing as skill." Rhea's voice softened. Then you're doing exactly what needs to be done. She stared at the mantel, at the photos of faces she had lost. Maybe he was right. Maybe teaching was more than just passing time, it was keeping their memory alive, making sure the lessons paid for in blood weren't forgotten. But the past never stayed buried for long. One morning, as she sipped coffee on her porch, a letter arrived in the mail, its return address stamped with military insignia. Her stomach clenched as she opened it, scanning the words that blurred with the weight of old familiarity. It was an invitation to speak at a regional veterans event, a gathering larger than the barbecue she had attended, with media coverage and officials in attendance. They wanted her to share her story, to talk about service, sacrifice, resilience. She read the letter twice, then folded it carefully, setting it on the table as though it might detonate. 4 hours she paced the house, torn between instinct and possibility. Speaking meant opening herself, peeling back scars she had hidden for years. It meant telling strangers about the tours, about the eye, about the squad that hadn't come home. But it also meant something else, showing that survival wasn't silence. She could almost hear Rhea's in her head, urging her to go, to step into the light, not for herself but for those who couldn't anymore. By the time the sun set, her decision was made. She picked up the phone, called the number on the letter, and said yes. The weeks that followed blurred into preparation. She kept teaching at the range, kept moving through her routines, but every night she sat at the table with a notebook, scratching down fragments of memory and thought. The smell of sand in the wind. The sound of laughter in the dark between missions. The searing light of the explosion that had taken her eye. The silence of coming home to a world that didn't understand. She wrote not to relive them but to capture them, to shape them into something she could share without shattering. When she looked at the pages, she saw not just pain but endurance. Not just loss but defiance. On the morning of the event, she dressed in her old uniform, the fabric faded but still sharp, the patches sewn like badges of another life. In the mirror, the woman who looked back at her was not the ghost who had haunted the edges of her town. She was Hawk again, not just the shooter, not just the survivor, but the soldier who had carried others through fire and come back to tell the tale. She adjusted the patch over her eye, squared her shoulders, and stepped into the day, ready for what came next. The hall was larger than she expected, its high ceiling hung with banners that bore unit crests from across the state. Rows of folding chairs stretched out like formations, filled with men and women in various stages of age and service, some in crisp uniforms, others in worn jackets that carried decades of history in their faded stitching. The low hum of conversation quieted as she entered, guided by an organizer to the stage where a podium and microphone stood waiting. Her chest tightened, not from fear exactly but from the gravity of the moment. For years she had hidden in silence, and now every step carried her closer to breaking that silence in front of strangers who might judge, pity, or misunderstand. Yet she didn't falter. Her boots struck the floor with steady rhythm, each sound a reminder that she was still here. When her name was announced, a wave of polite applause rose, but it was subdued, cautious. She knew why. Few in the crowd recognized her, fewer still expected much from a woman who bore scars plainly on her face. She stood behind the podium, adjusted the microphone, and for a long moment said nothing. Instead, she scanned the faces before her. Old sergeants with stiff backs, young recruits with restless eyes, widows clutching photographs of those who would never return. She drew a breath, and when she spoke, her voice carried clear. "My name is Hawk," she began, using the call sign that had once defined her more than any given name. "I served in Iraq and Afghanistan. I came home with one eye, a body full of shrapnel scars, and the memories of people who didn't make it back. For years I thought that was all I had left. But I was wrong." The silence in the room deepened, the kind that comes not from disinterest but from attention sharpened to a fine point. She told them of the desert nights, of the smell of burning sand after mortar fire, of laughter shared in tents that felt like the last safe place in the world. She told them of the convoy, the sudden flash, the sound of her own voice shouting commands she barely remembered giving. Her words painted not just battle but the bonds forged in it, bonds that had carried her farther than she believed possible. She didn't glorify war, didn't pretend it was noble, but she spoke of resilience, of what it meant to hold on when everything demanded you let go. "I thought survival was enough," she said softly, "but survival is only the beginning. What we do after, how we carry the weight, how we pass it forward, that's the real fight." By the time she finished, the hall was utterly still. Then slowly applause began, not polite this time but rising, swelling, breaking like thunder against the walls. Some stood, some wiped at their eyes, others pressed fists to their hearts. She didn't bow, didn't smile, She simply stepped back, letting the sound wash over her as something she hadn't felt in years took root. Recognition, yes, but also validation. She had spoken and they had heard. The silence she had carried was no longer hers alone. Afterward, people approached her, veterans, spouses, children. Some wanted to shake her hand, others simply wanted to look at her and know she was real. An old man with trembling hands pressed a small patch into her palm, his unit insignia from Vietnam. "For you," he whispered. A young recruit asked how she had kept going when she lost so much. She placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Because others needed me too," she said. "And when they didn't anymore, I learned I needed me too." But not everyone who watched her that day was moved with admiration. In the back of the hall, away from the warmth of the crowd, the stocky man from the range stood with arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He hadn't been invited, but word of her speech had spread fast. She saw him only briefly before he slipped out, but the flash of resentment in his eyes was unmistakable. It didn't surprise her. His pride had taken too many wounds already. Yet she couldn't worry about him. Not here, not now. When she returned home that evening, the sun was dipping low, painting the sky in streaks of amber and violet. She set the patch the old man had given her on the mantel, beside the photographs of her fallen squad. For the first time, she didn't feel that the faces in those frames were accusing her of surviving. Instead, she felt them standing with her, silent but proud. She poured herself a glass of water, sat on the porch, and let the quiet of her small town fold around her. The applause still echoed in her ears, but louder than that was the steady beat of her own heart, strong, unbroken. In the days that followed, invitations multiplied. Local schools asked her to speak. The sheriff offered her a role training young cadets. Veterans from neighboring towns reached out, some wanting to share their own stories, others simply wanting to hear hers again. She didn't accept them all. She chose carefully, guarding the parts of herself that were still fragile, but she accepted enough. With each speech, each gathering, she felt the boundaries of her exile shrink. The town that once saw her as an oddity now began to see her as something else. A symbol, a reminder that scars could hold strength. One evening, Reyes visited, driving hours just to sit on her porch with a six-pack of beer. They talked deep into the night, laughter and silence flowing easily between them. At one point he leaned back, studying her with a half-smile. "You're not the ghost I remember anymore," he said. She tilted her head. "And what am I now?" He raised his bottle in a small salute. "Alive. More alive than most people ever get." The words settled over her like a blessing, unexpected but deeply true. For years she had existed, breathing without living, walking without purpose. Now for the first time she felt the difference. Yet under the surface tension brewed. The men she had bested at the range hadn't forgotten, and her growing reputation only deepened their resentment. One night, graffiti appeared on the wall near the shooting range, "One-eyed fraud." She cleaned it quietly before the kids arrived, refusing to let them see weakness in their teacher. But inside she knew it was a warning. Her strength, her visibility, it was provoking those who thrived on intimidation. She wasn't afraid, but she understood what it meant. Every step into the light cast longer shadows. Still she refused to retreat. Instead she doubled down, showing up every Saturday, every event, every gathering. She trained harder, not for competition but for readiness, because she knew the past had a way of testing the present. Each morning she rose before dawn, her routine no longer about surviving the day but about sharpening herself for whatever might come. When she looked in the mirror now, the woman staring back wasn't broken. She was tempered, honed, carrying not just scars but the fire of resilience. And somewhere in that fire, a truth burned brighter than all the rest. She had finally reclaimed her place, not just in the world but in herself. Survival had once been her only goal. Now she lived not to endure, but to lead, to teach, to remind others that strength was not the absence of scars but the courage to bear them openly. The night was unusually still, the kind of quiet that pressed against the windows and made even the cicadas hesitate. Hawk sat at her kitchen table, a single lamp casting a pool of light over the paper she had been sorting. Notes for upcoming speeches, letters from veterans who had reached out after hearing her story, invitations from schools and community centers. The pile had grown taller each week, a testament to how far she had come. But tonight her attention wasn't on the letters. Her mind circled back to the graffiti she had scrubbed from the range wall, the word fraud lingering in her memory like smoke that refused to clear. She had dismissed it outwardly, but she knew what it meant. Someone wasn't content with resentment. Someone wanted to diminish her. Her instincts, sharpened by years of patrols and ambushes, told her the threat wasn't over. The men she had beaten at the range had been silent since, but silence wasn't peace, it was preparation. She stood, moving through her house with the habitual caution she could never fully unlearn, checking locks, scanning the yard. The scars across her skin ached faintly, an old reminder of what it felt like when danger arrived unannounced. She poured a glass of water and tried to push the unease aside, but her hand lingered near the pistol she now kept on the counter. Survival wasn't just memory. It was reflex. 2 days later, the warning became action. She arrived at the range early as always to set up for the kids who came to train. The air smelled of damp earth from the night's rain, and the targets glistened faintly in the weak morning sun. But when she opened the equipment shed, her breath caught. The rifles and pistols were gone, every one of them stolen in the night. Worse still, the walls were spray-painted again, this time with words meant to wound deeper. She doesn't belong. She lies. She's no soldier. Her jaw clenched, rage mixing with a familiar cold calculation. This wasn't simple vandalism, it was a message, deliberate and personal. Someone wanted to erase not just her efforts but her credibility. She called the sheriff, who arrived with deputies, his face tight with concern. "We'll find who did this," he promised, but she saw in his eyes the hesitation. In a town this small, law enforcement often knew too well who the culprits might be, and knew just as well how slippery proof could be. Word spread quickly. Some townsfolk were sympathetic, showing up that evening to help her scrub the paint and take inventory of what had been lost. Others, though, whispered in corners, their doubt resurfacing. Maybe she made enemies, one muttered. Maybe she brought this on herself. Hawk heard fragments, felt the shift in the air. Her reputation had risen high, but that only made the fall more tempting for those eager to see her stumble. That night Reyes called. She didn't tell him at first, she didn't want to drag him back into a fight that wasn't his. But he knew her too well, heard the edge in her voice. "Tell me," he pressed, and finally she did. Silence stretched on the line, then his voice came low and steady. "You're not fighting this alone. I'll come back." She argued, but he cut her off. "You've carried too much by yourself already. It's time someone else carried with you." True to his word, he arrived 2 days later, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder, his presence filling her porch like a long-awaited storm. Together they began rebuilding, ordering new equipment, reinforcing the shed, setting cameras around the property. His presence steadied her, reminded her of what it was like to have someone at her back again. At night, they sat on the porch, and though words were few, the silence between them was no longer heavy. It was shared, a bond reforged in the crucible of both past and present battles. But her enemies didn't stop. A week later, during one of her speeches at a nearby school, hecklers appeared. They shouted accusations, that she exaggerated her service, that her injuries weren't what she claimed, that she was a fraud seeking attention. For a moment, the old weight threatened to crush her. The shame, the doubt, the fear of being misunderstood, all of it surged. But then she remembered the hall, the veterans who had stood for her, the patch in her pocket from the old man at the first event. She stood taller, her voice cutting through the jeers. "I don't need to prove my scars to anyone," she said. "They're not for show. They're reminders that I lived. And every day I stand here, I choose to live again. If you can't understand that, I won't waste my breath convincing you." The room erupted, not in division but in support. The hecklers slunk away, drowned by applause. Reyes grinned at her afterward. "Damn," he said, "you've gotten better at speeches." She smirked. Pain makes a good teacher. Still, she knew the conflict hadn't reached its end. The men who hated her were emboldened, not silenced. She trained harder, not for vengeance but for preparedness. Each morning she ran until her lungs burned, practiced until her arms shook. Not out of fear but out of defiance. Her survival had always been about more than herself. Now it was about protecting the space she had carved, not just for her but for the kids she trained, the veterans who found hope in her words, the town that was learning to see scars as strength. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the fields in molten gold, she stood with Reyes on the porch. He asked her quietly, "If it comes to a fight, will you be ready?" She looked out across the horizon, the same horizon she had once thought held nothing for her. Now it held everything. She flexed her scarred hand, felt the strength in her body, the fire in her chest. "I've been ready my whole life," she said. And in that moment she understood something deeper than she ever had before. Her story wasn't just survival, wasn't just resilience. It was defiance against every force that had tried to silence her, from the desert sands to the quiet streets of her town. And she knew no matter what came next, she would not bend. The fight wasn't over. But neither was she. The storm finally broke on a night heavy with rain. Hawk had sensed it coming for days, the uneasy quiet, the sideways glances, the way even the air felt charged with tension. She wasn't surprised when the barking of her dog jolted her from sleep at 2 a.m. She rolled from bed, bare feet landing silently on the floorboards, her good eye already scanning the shadows beyond the rain-streaked window. A faint movement by the equipment shed confirmed what she knew all along: they weren't done with her. She slipped into her boots, pulled her jacket over the tank top she wore, and reached for the pistol she kept ready. Old instincts took over, the calm breathing, the steadying of her pulse, the sharp focus that had carried her through ambushes and foreign deserts. She moved into the night like part of it, rain soaking her hair, her scars glistening faintly as lightning split the sky. Near the shed, two figures bent over the lock, crowbars in hand. Their muffled curses carried over the storm. She recognized them instantly, the same men from the range, the ones whose pride had been shattered by her precision. "Back away from the shed," she called, voice sharp as the thunder overhead. The men froze, then turned, surprise flashing across their faces. One sneered. "Look at you," he spat, his voice slurred with drink. "Playing soldier in your backyard. This ain't war, lady. You don't belong here." Hawk stepped closer, pistol steady, rain dripping down her brow. "I don't need a battlefield to defend what's mine," she said. Her tone was calm, but her muscles were coiled, ready. They hesitated, but pride was a dangerous fuel. The bigger of the two swung his crowbar, not at her but at the shed, the crash of metal against wood ringing out defiantly. "We'll show everyone you're a fraud," he shouted. Before he could swing again, Reyes's voice cut through the rain. "Drop it." He emerged from the darkness behind them, his rifle leveled, his stance steady. The men stiffened, caught between two warriors who no longer needed uniforms to command authority. "You don't want to test us," Reyes said, his voice low and sure. The smaller man cursed under his breath, tossing the crowbar aside. The larger one hesitated longer, defiance warring with fear, before finally letting the metal slip from his hand. The sheriff's lights appeared minutes later, painting the rain-slicked yard in red and blue. The deputies moved quickly, cuffing the men, their protests drowned by the storm. Hawk lowered her pistol only when the cruiser pulled away, its tires spitting water onto the road. She stood there a long moment, rain plastering her hair to her face, her body trembling not with fear but with the electric aftershock of confrontation. Reyes touched her shoulder lightly. "It's over," he said. But she shook her head. "No," she murmured. "It's never really over. Not for people like us."